Today we're going to be talking about the Cartesian coordinate system. So before we get into that, let's remind ourselves the Cartesian coordinate system is made up out of the x and y axis and all of the points that go along with them. So again, just to remember, x is our horizontal axis, y is our vertical axis, and it divides our area into 4 different quadrants. Quadrant 1 in the top right, 2 top left, 3 bottom left, and quadrant 4 in the bottom right. You can always remember you just start top right and you go counterclockwise as we count. In your classwork that we're going to work on tomorrow, you're going to have a couple problems that just list points and then ask you what quadrants they're in. We're not going to go over that right now, so if you have a question on that, make sure to ask me when we're doing our classwork tomorrow. We are going to start right now just by talking about how to find distance. And if I want the distance between 2 points and they just happen to be numbers, not full coordinates, all we're going to have to do is subtract our numbers. So 12 minus 27. When I go ahead and subtract that, that gives me negative 15. And when we take distance, we never want a negative number because I can't go negative 15 feet. So my distance would just be 15. So likewise for this one, I'm going to take negative 3 and I'm going to subtract 15, which will give me the absolute value of negative 18, which will just give me 18 for a distance. Loads of fun when we throw decimals in the mix. So I'm going to have negative 2.5 and minus a negative 10.7. Just as a reminder, we never ever subtract numbers. So this is really negative 2.5 plus 10.7. If you want to, you can go ahead and plug that in your calculator, or you can actually subtract it. I know that if I take 0.7 and I take away 0.45, I'm going to get 0.25, and 10 minus my 2 is going to give me 8. So again, however you want to go ahead and subtract that out, I'm completely okay with. If I want to be able to rewrite some of my distance formulas without having to use absolute values, we just need to pay a little bit of attention. If I do 20 minus 45, that gives me negative 25, right? So inside my absolute values, that would be negative 25. So if I want to be able to write the exact same or get the same values that I'm supposed to, which is 25, I just need to pay attention to which number is bigger. If I want to be able to get 25 using the same thing but not having to write the absolute value bars, if I just had switched my numbers to say 45 minus 20, then the absolute value bars wouldn't have mattered because it would still just be the absolute value of 25, which would go back to this. So if your first number is smaller, to be able to get rid of the absolute values, you're just going to switch them. So this, our answer is just going to be 45 minus 20. Is the same thing without the absolute value bar. For our second one here, we have rad 15 and 20. So again, our question is which one is bigger? The easiest way to do this is to compare similar radicals. 20 squared is going to give me 400. So this is the square root of 400, which is obviously bigger than the square root of 15 because 400 is bigger than 15. So to fix it, I would go the square root of 400 minus the square root of 15. But instead of saying the square root of 400, I could just say 20. And that's going to give me my answer for my second one. For my third one, again, I'm going to look and I'm going to see which number is bigger. Pi here is the number 3.14. So if I take pi and I subtract 2, the absolute value bars are actually irrelevant because 3 is already bigger than 2. So when I subtract them, I'm still going to get a positive number. Now when I start going into the Cartesian coordinate system and I want to deal with distance and midpoint, to find my distance, I'm going to subtract my x's and square them. I'm going to subtract my y's and square them. And I'm going to add them together and throw them in a square root. Midpoint is all about averaging. So if I take my x's and I add them together and divide by 2, or average my x's and average my y's, it will give me my midpoint. So now we're just going to find distance and midpoint for a couple things. Let's start with finding our distance. Again, let's remind ourselves our formula is distance is the square root of x2 minus x1 quantity squared plus y2 minus y1 quantity squared. Remember that every point goes xy in our coordinates. Which one I choose to call point 1 and point 2 doesn't matter. I call point 1 the first one and I call point 2 the second one. So when I go to do my distance here, it's going to be the square root And again, remember, I'm going to take my x's and I'm going to subtract them. So -1 minus 2 squared plus, and now I'm going to take my y's and I'm going to subtract them. 7 minus 4 squared. So now I'm going to do some arithmetic. -1 minus 2 gives me a -3. Then 7 minus 4 also gives me a 3. -3 times -3 is going to give me 9, plus 3 times 3 gives me 9. Please be careful and make sure that when you square -3, you get a positive number. Every time we do distance formula, we should never have a negative when we get to this stage. This is going to become the square root of 18, which is a perfectly acceptable answer. You can give me that on any test or quiz. If you would like a bonus point on your test, you can go ahead and simplify the radical by factoring. That's 9 times 2. 9 is 3 times 3. So this would be 3 radical 2. So again, that would count as a bonus point. And now let's go ahead and do the exact same thing, but over here. So my distance is going to be the square root. I'm going to take my x's and subtract them and square them. And I'm going to take my y's and subtract them and square them. So my x's are 9, and it's minus a -3. My y's are -5 minus 0. So that's going to be 12 squared plus -5 squared, still inside of a radical. 12 squared gives me 144 plus 25 for -5 squared, which is going to give me the square root of 169, which is 13. If my radical comes out pretty, you need to tell me what that is. You can only leave radicals if they're kind of ugly. For a test or quiz, how much work you show me, I understand a lot of this you can probably do in your head. I need at least one step in here so I can follow how you've gotten your numbers. So please make sure you're doing that for me. Okay, so now if I want to go ahead and find the midpoint, again, like where our formula said before, midpoint is going to tell me to take my x's, add them together and divide by 2, and then to do the same thing with my y coordinates. So my midpoint here is going to be 2 plus -6 divided by 2, and 5 plus 7 divided by 2. 2 plus -6 gives me -4. 5 plus 7 gives me 12. So I'm going to get -2 and 6 for my midpoint. Go ahead and take a second and find the midpoint for the second one, and we'll compare answers in a second. Go ahead and hit pause on the video real quick while you do this, and then unpause it when you have an answer and you can compare it with mine. Okay, we should have ended up with a midpoint of 3 and -5/2. Could have also called it -2.5. That's perfectly okay. You need to make sure you reduce fractions, so 6/2 can't be left as an answer, but improper fractions are perfectly okay. If you want, you can go ahead and pause and take a look at my work if you got something that's different. See if you can find your error. If you can't, circle this one, and tomorrow when we go through questions, make sure you ask. Actually, let's go back to that really quick. What happens if I only give you 2 numbers? So if I ask you to find the midpoint between -7 and 15, how would we do that? It's not really any different. The only change we're going to have is that we don't have an x and a y coordinate. So to find our midpoint, we're just going to take -7 and 15, and we're just going to average those. -7 plus 15 is 8. 8/2 gives me 4. So the midpoint between those numbers just is 4. It's on a single number line instead of a Cartesian coordinate, so we're only going to have one point for our answer. Now let's go ahead and take a look at a couple shapes, determine our area and perimeter, and then we're done for today. So if I want to determine the area and the perimeter of a figure that's determined by given points, the first thing I probably want to do is graph my points so that way I can kind of see what I'm looking at. Like I was saying earlier, I'm not a big fan of like counting out each of your marks, so as long as your scale is roughly okay, that's fine. So -2, 1 is going to be about here. I went left 2 and up 1. If I go to the right 3 and down 3, that's going to give me this point. And 7, 2 is going to go to the right 7 and up 2. And now if I look at what shape I formed, I should realize that I have a triangle. So let's start by finding the perimeter, because that's just going to require us to use our distance formula, right? So if I want to go ahead and use my distance formula, I'm going to have to find, I'm going to call them A, B, and C for now because it makes it a little bit easier to talk about. If I want the distance between A, it's going to be the square root, and I'm going to subtract my x's, so 7 minus a negative 2, and I'm going to subtract my y's, so 2 minus 1, and they're going to get squared and added together. 7 plus 2 is going to give me 9. 9 squared gives me 81. And 2 minus 1 gives me 1. 1 squared is 1. So A here is going to be the square root of 82. Now I'm going to go ahead and find the distance between B. So again, same thing. I'm going to take a square root. I'm going to take my x's, which are 7 and 3, and subtract them. And then I'm going to take my y's, which are 2 and negative 3, and square them. 7 minus 3 is going to give me 4. When I square that, I'm going to get 16. And then I'm going to add 2 and 3 make 5, and when I square that, I'm going to get 25. And 16 plus 25 is the square root of 41. And last but not least, I need my distance over here for C. So again, I'm going to take my x's and my y's of the distance that's formed between C. So that's negative 2 minus 3, and 1 minus a negative 3. Both of those are squared, and there's a plus sign in between those, I promise. So that's going to give me negative 5, and when I square negative 5, that's going to give me 25. 1 and 3 give me 4. When I square 4, I get 16. So this side's also going to be the square root of 41. So my perimeter, remember that to find perimeter of a shape, we're just going to add up all our sides. So the square root of 82 plus the square root of 41 plus the square root of 41. I can find out the exact number by just plugging that in my calculator, or if I want to, I can be a little bit lazier. I know that square root 41 plus square root 41 is 2 square root 41s, and then I can add the square root of 82. And again, if you want to simplify the square root of 82, that's 2 times 41, which isn't going to reduce anymore. So that's the simplest I can make it without using a calculator. So last but not least, I need to find my area. And for a triangle, we know that area is 1/2 the base times the height. And remember that the height is the distance between the base and the opposite side. So I'm going to use A as my base, just because that one tends to be the longest side. And then I'm going to make my height this distance right here, the distance between line A and this point right here. So it's going to be 1/2 the square root of 82. And to find the height between those, I'm just going to count. So all I need to know is how far straight up it is. So this has a y-coordinate of negative 3. And I have a height up here of 2, so I went from negative 3 up to 2. So I went up a distance of 5 here. So my area is going to be 5 the square root of 82 all over 2. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at what happens if we have a quadrilateral or a four-sided figure, which is actually going to be a little bit nicer for this one. So if I go ahead and take a look at this, negative 2, 1 is going to go here, negative 2, 6 is going to go right up above it. The nice thing about that is that I can count. I should already be able to tell that that's going to have a distance of 5, because I just went from y being 1 up to when y is 6. Then I'm going to go over here to 4, 1 and 4, 6, because those are my other 2 points. And again, since they're nice, perfectly straight lines, that's going to make counting a whole lot easier. Again, this side here was 5, because I went up from 1 to 6. When I move from left to right, I went from negative 2 to 4, which is a total distance of 6. So my perimeter is going to be 12 plus 10, so 22. And my area is going to be my length times my width, so 5 times 6, which is going to give me 30. Hopefully those should make a little bit of sense. If not, we'll talk about them tomorrow. You're going to have some in-class assignments on page 11 and 19. They're odd, so you should be able to check your answers in the back of the book. I look forward to going over questions with you tomorrow.